We're going to head north to Anatolia to the site of Çatalhöyük. So Çatalhöyük was inhabited from about 7,500 BC to roughly 5,600 BC, so about 2,000 years. This is a late Neolithic site. It is at the very north edge of one of the rough definitions of the Fertile Crescent. It is in a flat piece, a relatively flat area of southern Anatolia called the Konya Plain. And although it is pretty arid today, in the Neolithic, it was actually very well watered and in fact quite swampy. Why did people settle there? It seems also to have been a point for mining and processing obsidian, which could be found nearby. So this is one of the largest settlements of the time. The estimated population is somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people at the height of its habitation. We find pottery in all levels of Çatalhöyük, from the earliest phases of the site all the way through its abandonment in the middle of the 6th millennium BC. And this is two distinct habitation areas. There are two mounds across, just a few hundred yards away from each other. The east mound is the better known of the two areas. It's larger. It seems to have been perhaps wealthier, and it was inhabited from about 7,500 to roughly 6,000 BC. The west mound was inhabited is smaller and was inhabited for a much shorter period of time, just 500 years, in the late Neolithic. So, Çatalhöyük was discovered in the late 1950s and first excavated in the first half of the 1960s by an Anglo-Dutch archaeologist named James Millart. We're going to talk a lot more about James Millart. He is the first person to make Çatalhöyük famous as an archaeological site. And we are only, just as a profession, only just starting to deal with some of the fallout of James Millart's career, for good and for ill, in the last 10 years or so. In the early 1990s, Millart's excavations ended in 1965. In the early 1990s, an archaeologist from the UK, a theorist named Ian Hodder, who is one of the big names behind post-processual archaeology, if you remember back to the second lecture, he led excavations at Çatalhöyük until about 2018. And since 2018, for the first time in the history of this as an archaeological site, we actually have a Turk in charge of the excavation, Ali Umut Turkan, who is in charge still today. It is a very large site. It's over 15 acres in size, and only a small part of it has been excavated. And this is what we call a tell. This is and I will talk more about tells at much greater length in a bit. A tell is essentially an artificial hill made out of layers and layers and layers of human habitation. About 22 meters in depth of occupation at Çatalhöyük, and in at least 18 levels. And at Çatalhöyük, they number them from the top to the bottom. So Çatalhöyük 1 is the first level that was excavated at the top of the hill. and they are numbered down. We will find archaeologists using the opposite scheme in certain places. So the earliest phase is numbered, 1, and then the next one 2. It's a choice that excavators make. So this is what the excavations at Çatalhöyük look like today. This is the topographic map, and you can see these areas here are the areas that have been excavated, and the hill itself is, pretty much all settlement. Similarly, here in the West Mound, which you can see is just about half the size of the East Mound, there are just a few areas that have started to be excavated. If you go to Çatalhöyük, which you can, there's a large museum on site, this is what you will see. Areas of excavation, and many of these excavations are very deep. As I said, 22 meters at least of settlement. So, archaeologists have to be pretty careful and strategic, and because trenches do collapse and people do get killed that way. You can see that, like Göbekli Tepe, these buildings they're rectangular, and they are all packed in together. And in fact, these houses, rectilinear, late Neolithic, are in fact, built very close together. Some of them share walls, some of them do not. These, like Göbekli Tepe, seem to have been entered through the rooftop. There is extensive use of plaster, and many of these houses were plastered at least annually, and perhaps as often as every season. Hundreds, up to 450 layers of plaster have been found in some of these houses. There's also, a similarity and a certain amount of rough standardization to these houses. This suggests that this was a fairly unstratified community. And in fact, I'll talk a bit about the later phases of Çatalhöyük, where that seems to change and may have had something to do with the end of the site. But for most of its history, Çatalhöyük seems to have been a relatively egalitarian community. We haven't really found any clear public architecture, although, perhaps some of these open courtyards served some of those functions. What we have found is a fascinating integration of what might be considered, art that may have a ritual purpose with the spaces of daily life. So, buildings are very close together. Not all of them were connected at roof level, but at least for some of them you could walk across the rooftops between houses. There are many possibilities for why this is the case. Protection of some sort, protection from wild animals or other people, although, if it was although, the animals seem to have been kept outside at ground level. So, we're still thinking about some of the fundamentals of this site, even though it is so famous and so well known. Buildings were replaced very frequently, and so we know the site would have changed quite a bit over the course of any given person's lifetime. And these replacements of buildings are what actually build up the settlement mound over the course of time. The upper levels of one of these houses might have looked something like this. So we have, again, a structure of timber beams holding up the roof, and you enter the houses through the roof, which acts also as a smoke hole for the little clay and plaster oven that was the main source of heat and a cooking surface for the family. Inside the houses, we find areas delineated by rectangular platforms of a variety of levels. We find these houses to be very clean. They seem to have been kept very, tidy and cleaned on a regular basis. We find wall paintings, and like some of the other places we have talked about, we find burials underneath the houses themselves, under these platforms. So like, if this was a sleeping platform, you're sleeping where your ancestors have slept. It's there must have been some very interesting social messaging and symbolism around these houses, and the depth in time and the creation of family around place. So, just as an illustration of these where I said earlier buildings were replaced frequently, they kept the settlement in constant flux. This is what we call tell formation. This is a tell site that I'll talk about further. I've tried to illustrate this by taking this illustration, copying it, compressing it down, and trying to show you how layers of different phases of these houses might build up over time. The way of doing this is actually in an archaeological plan. This is a section of the part of the Çatalhöyük settlement. Excuse me. So as if you had sliced this part of the site like a cake along a line from east to west, so you're looking south in this image, you would see these white areas are existing walls. This walls in sections. So these are walls that have been, cut in half by this imaginary slice through this part of the site. We have areas that were filled in, as in here and here. We have a spot here, and in a couple other places where it seems like people were retrieving wooden posts to use later. So that's an interesting piece of information, that wood was important enough that that when these houses were demolished and then filled in, packed down, and built on top of again, they pulled out wooden posts to reuse. We have an area here that was used for penning animals, and then a house was built on top of it. And we have several places that are middens, which is a pit where you dispose of your trash. Archaeologists love middens. We learn all sorts of things from them. And interestingly, as you can see, like especially here, all of these, places where it looks like walls were just built on top of walls, many of these houses were often rebuilt many times on very similar footprints. So the plan of the house would remain the same, even as its earlier incarnation was dismantled and filled in and kind of packed down to serve as the foundation of the next generation of that house. So, as I mentioned, this is what is called tell formation. A tell is a series of cultural deposits resulting in a mound. They appear all over Syria and Anatolia and the Levant, Mesopotamia, and in many parts of, especially Eastern Europe. The word tell is Arabic. It's the Arabic word for little hill, or this particular formation. In Turkish, they use the words tepe or huyuk for, the similar thing, as we've talked about Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük. Um, Furthermore, in Eastern Europe, in Macedonia, they're called tumbas, and in the Thessaly region of northern Greece, they're called maguls. This is Tel Bari. It is one of the largest tells in existence. It is 32 meters high. That is just about 105 feet high. And remember, this would have been subject to erosion, so it would probably have been taller at its, highest extent. It covers 90 acres. This was the site of a city founded around 4000 BC and inhabited continuously through the Islamic period. And this, just to give you some sense of scale, we've got cuts for excavations up here and up here. And in one of these, this is a close-up of the cut. Here's a person. That's a person. That's how big this site is. So let's get back to Çatalhöyük. At Çatalhöyük, we see ideas about life after death being expressed in elaborate burial customs. As I mentioned, with other sites, we have these burials underneath the platforms in the site. It's in the houses themselves. Sometimes 10 or more people over the course of a generation buried in this same location. We find in some cases partial or total removal of flesh from the body before burial. There's a very strong interest in the skeleton, and especially, as I've mentioned before, the skull in many cultures in this part of the Neolithic world. And with the bodies, we find vessels with food and red ochre. Red ochre is a pigment. It's usually ground up clay or soft kinds of stone that include a very large amount of iron oxide. So it's rust red. So these are the last human remains in the PowerPoint, just for everyone's, knowledge and comfort. Çatalhöyük, in addition to its, large population and extremely dense architecture, and, fascinating burial rituals, is also famous for its wall paintings. So this is where we have to talk about the problem of James Millart. Millart, James Millart died in 2012. He stopped excavations at Çatalhöyük in 1965 because he got kicked out of Turkey by the Turkish government for being involved in a bunch of shady, possibly forgeries, possibly smuggling, possibly just badly reported antiquities sales. And that was the end of his excavation at Çatalhöyük. However, in the 1970s and 80s, he started publishing what he said were the results of further study of fragments of wall paintings that he had found at Çatalhöyük. Now, this is not the only set of materials that Millart has been accused of forging. And I'm not going to get into all of the rest of them. They cover wide spans of time, mostly in Turkey. But pretty much anything found under Millart in the 1960s needs to be rethought, reevaluated, and verified at this point. Um, there are large numbers of images of wall paintings that he claimed to have found at Çatalhöyük that he um, published as reconstructions, reconstructed from fragments in the 1970s and 80s, that there is no solid, actual physical objects associated with them that can be found in any Çatalhöyük archives or any museum in Turkey. Those are probably fakes. Um, so this is a problem. I'm going to show you a bunch of wall painting from Çatalhöyük. Um, First of all, because it is widely known and um, widely taught in other art history that deals with the Neolithic period. I am going to do my best to keep it to things where we have actual physical remains, either that are still in place on the site or that were taken from Çatalhöyük and are now in museums in Turkey. And also things like this, which thankfully were found in the excavations led by Ian Hodder. This one was found around 2010, and which we can verify are in fact authentic from Çatalhöyük itself, not from the imagination and workshops and of James Millart. So these are two paintings that were found during the 1960s, so during the Millart years. This guy, this massive bull painting, we have photographs of it in place on the wall. This painting of a group of humans hunting a very large deer, and a similar painting this is a drawing of fragments. This is in a museum in Turkey. So these show a variety of wild animals in hunting scenes. Millart Millart came up with a lot of ideas about the ritual significance of the art at Çatalhöyük, that has had a lot of influence in the present, or at least after his excavations in the 1960s, but which again we have to really consider very critically at this point. In these cases with the hunting, Millart is positing some sort of bull cult, some sort of cult of male fertility, that seems to be a little too pat. There are possibilities that these images, especially of the aurochs here, might be useful for thinking about the processes of domestication, capture of wild animals, being part of the process of domestication. Also see other things. An interest in we're essentially leopard skin clothing, or what we think may be leopard skin clothing. This is another one of Millart's drawings. I'm just gonna show this to you as one possibility for seeing these groups of people with their like leopard skin belts. This is another one that is in place on the wall. There are, again, lots of questions whether we can actually say is this leopard skin. Leopards are found, however, in many places around the site and in a large amount of the visual culture of Çatalhöyük. this may, if these are leopard skin garments, I mean, this may be some sort of, way of identifying people as a group. Um, Perhaps the Neolithic version of on Wednesdays we wear pink. On, when hunting we wear leopards. Um, and there may be some sort of, oh, ritual, implication of maybe trying to take on the ferocity and hunting skill of the leopard. If this is a thing that we can now re-show is widespread around the site itself. Continuing with material culture, Çatalhöyük is the site of some of the first surviving significant remains of textiles. These are, this is one piece of carbonized twined textile, sort of a meshy, netty textile that was found at Çatalhöyük in the 60s. This is a pile of carbonized, essentially, burnt in a very low oxygen environment, essentially turned to charcoal. This is another set of textile fragments where you can really see the weave of the fabric itself. This is a basic kind of open plain weave fabric, over one, under one, over one, under one. I'm sure you all did that on a little card loom, making potholders when you were in kindergarten. Interestingly, these were originally thought to have been linen, to be the product of the flax plant. This bunch of textile finds, of textile remains, were actually reassessed in 2021, and scanning electron microscope analysis of those textiles show that actually these are not made of linen or wool. They're made of fiber derived from the long strips of harvested from the inner bark of oak trees, what's called tree bast. This is really interesting, that the people of Çatalhöyük were using essentially, the inner part of tree bark as a textile material, as well as using wood for, structural purposes, for building things, and presumably also for artifacts that have not survived, because wood, like textiles, decays in the soil pretty quickly. Because large-scale environmental studies of the area around Çatalhöyük have shown a lot of environmental problems in the wider area in the later phases of people's living at the site, including deforestation in the area. And, you have to wonder, how much this, if this may have contributed. So, it's not just paintings that are on the walls at Çatalhöyük. There are also some dramatic three-dimensional plaster reliefs. So when you are, if you are going to replaster the inside of your house at least every year, you might as well take advantage of the sculptural properties of plaster and, give yourself some, extra, extra three-dimensionality. So, we can compare these to those freestanding sculptures from Aincasal. We see a lot of bullheads used in the plaster sculpture attached to the interiors of the houses in Çatalhöyük. This is a bench that uses bull skulls with the horns still attached as part of the walls of the bench. This is one of Millart's reconstructions. So you see these, plastered bull skulls. We see another one here. And what Millart called the mother goddess giving birth to animals, based probably on a plaster figurine figurine, a plaster relief similar to this, that has these concentric circles on the belly. He's like, oh, this is obviously pregnancy. And once again, this is one of those interpretations that Millart had that, really needs to be rethought. Although we do have freestanding sculpture of women from Çatalhöyük that we'll look at in a bit. It now seems, since these sort of, I don't know what to call these saguaro cactus pose figures, have never been found with an intact head or intact hands. The original identification as a goddess, as a humanoid figure, was frankly just a guess. Instead, in 2003 and 2005, Ian Hodder and his team found examples of a very similar figure intact, but it's on a much smaller scale. These are stamp seals, and I will talk a great deal about seals in the next lecture and in lecture 5. But this is quite small. You can see this is a 3 centimeter measure here. It's maybe 4 centimeters across by 5 centimeters tall. And the examples that Hodder and his team found were very clearly bears. So you can see, like, here are little ears, here's the muzzle, and even though this one's forepaws are missing, you can see the claws here on the back. So these, plaster reliefs are maybe as likely to be bears or some other kind of animal rather than goddesses. We also find a lot of leopards at Çatalhöyük. This is a photograph, again from the Millart years, but this is a photograph of it in place just after it's been excavated, so we can feel pretty confident about the authenticity of this guy. This is one of a pair, and you can see them here, these pairs of leopards facing each other, that were found in other dwellings in Çatalhöyük. Interestingly, another sort of assurance of its authenticity is that these were replastered and repainted several times. So you can see, layers of plaster, of maintenance, and the performance of care happening with these figurines. So, clay figurines. This is the last kind of material culture from Çatalhöyük that we'll look at. This on the right is the most famous figurine from Çatalhöyük. This was found in a storage pit, bottom of a plastered storage pit that seems to have been used for grain. This is called the seated woman of Çatalhöyük, sometimes the seated goddess of Çatalhöyük, sometimes woman and leopards. Sometimes, however, these little animals are identified as sheep. Sometimes they're called lionesses. There's a lot of interpretation, again, going on here. The older, Millart era interpretation of these is that they are associated with domestication of animals, the control and regulation of reproduction, based on the hanging belly and hanging breasts of this woman and the exaggeration of the amount of body fat on her. These are thought to be exaggerations of signs of reproduction. So this one was found in a grain storage bin. However, more recent scholarship has pointed out that, even though Millart found about 200 figurines in the 5 years that he worked at Çatalhöyük, more recent excavations have, immensely increased that amount of objects to look at and think about. So more than 1,500, almost 2,000 figurines have been found at Çatalhöyük, and the vast majority overall if you look at the entire body of figurines, the vast majority are animals. And less than 5% are clearly female. So once again, as with the wall paintings, we need to like recalibrate the importance of humans, or the human representation of humans in the material culture of this archaeological site. So, okay, that's Çatalhöyük. We're going to switch topics because the Neolithic was not just a period of development of pyrotechnology, so technology that involves fire, plaster making, ceramics, those sorts of things. It is also a period of the development of seafaring. Now, I'm specifically not going to call it sailing, because we don't think that people were using sails in this period. So it wasn't wind-powered boats. These were probably paddled. There have been recently some really spectacular finds of Neolithic era wooden canoes in Italy that have revolutionized our understanding of Neolithic boat building. Experimental archaeologists in the mid-1990s undertook multiple experiments of using traditional styles of reed boats from the island of Corfu, which were completely achievable with Neolithic technology, and using them to paddle paddle on days-long journeys between islands in the Aegean Sea. The Neolithic period is also the time when we see the first human presence on the island of Cyprus. So this is Cyprus, large island, off looking, I don't know, vaguely like a horseshoe crab, off the east coast of the Mediterranean. And on Cyprus, where it seems that humans hunted the species of dwarf hippopotamus that were indigenous to Cyprus into extinction, alas, because who wouldn't want to see dwarf hippopotamuses? We see some, fascinating similarities and persistences of things from the pre-pottery Neolithic into the pottery Neolithic. So this is one village on Cyprus. These are reconstructions of the Neolithic houses, and you notice they're round. Cyprus held on to its round architecture for a very long time. But, in 6000 BC, we are solidly into the pottery Neolithic. Islands are weird places. They can be, extremely conservative in some ways with material culture, and extremely experimental and innovative in others. So we have on Cyprus the combination of pre-pottery Neolithic elements, these round, this round architecture, with things that are, indicative of the pottery Neolithic, these burials under the floors of houses. This is a photograph of one of these burials that's actually been set into the floor of one of these reconstructed houses. And, some fascinating experiments. This is a figurine made out of a kind of green stone called picrolite, and it has both male and female characteristics. So it is less clear on this one, but on many of them, you see an emphasized pubic triangle, like a woman, but up here, you notice this little split at the top of the head, and the elongated neck above this kind of bulbous shaped, above this bulbous shaped head. This is very clearly, at least to an art historian, very clearly intended to be, a phallic shape. representing the male genitalia, um, on, on this half of the sculpture. And even more interestingly, so it's got both male and female sexual characteristics. Even more interesting, this little, stone figurine has a copy of itself. Another little representation of one of these figurines, worn on a cord around its neck. We think this may have, been used as some sort of fertility charm, um, with the, combination of male and female. The thing wearing its own image, like, say, carrying a fetus. Um, they are fascinating little objects. So, that brings us to the end of the Neolithic period. Around 4,500, we start to see, um, a regular, use of a, fascinating new material, metal. This is a period that's sometimes called the Chalcolithic period. This is the Copper Age. Chalkos is one of the, Greek words for copper. Chalcolithic, so the Copper Stone Age. Um, in terms of climate, it's pretty wet. Um, this is a period called the Mid-Holocene Climactic Optimum. Village communities persist, and we start to see copper, being traded long distances. So far we've seen, turquoise, we've seen shells, we've seen several other materials that seem to be, obsidian, that seem to be traded very long distances. This is the precursor to the Bronze Age, which is where we will pick up in the next lecture. So the earliest evidence of, widespread olive tree horticulture, so the deliberate planting of cultivated olives, is from this period. We start to see even more widespread use of milk, and cheese, developed, just a couple thousand years before, but this is when it really takes off. And we start to see, monumental temples, which we will see a whole lot of as we transition into the Bronze Age. So, just a couple words about bronze. Bronze is a man-made alloy, of two different kinds of metals. Copper, which, is seen in the northern, to the north of the Fertile Crescent, earlier than, we see it in the Levant. We Copper itself is quite soft. However, you can harden it either by including, arsenic, at a concentration of about 1 to 7%, or far less toxic, you can include a 5 to 15%. Usually the optimum is about 10%, by weight, quantity of a different metal called tin. Now, tin is really quite rare in, Eastern Europe. And it exists in a few places in Western Europe. But it is, and I will talk, but it is the search for tin, that really is one of the fundamental motivating forces of, societies in the Bronze Age. So, we will see, starting in the next lecture, the growth of what we can really start to think of as urbanism. And the beginnings, not in the next lecture, but after that, of an urban culture in Egypt. We start to see the widespread fortification of cities, and, so we are in the next lecture, moving east and south to look at the first permanent settlements and states, and ultimately the first cities of Mesopotamia.